Hello and welcome back to Storytime with Mr. Laws. Today we're reading Wayside School Gets a Little Stranger by Lewis Sacca. Chapter 13, The New Teacher. The new teacher entered the classroom carrying a big blue notebook stuffed with papers. She had white hair and wore glasses. She was a lot older than anyone else in the class. She took a big breath. "My, it's tiring walking up all those stairs, isn't it?" she said. Nobody said anything. They just stared at her. She put her notebook on the teacher's desk. "My name is Mrs. Drazil," she said, "and I'm not from Brazil." She smiled at her little joke. Nobody else smiled. After Mrs. and Mr. Gorf, they didn't trust teachers. Drazil, thought Dee. Where have I heard that name before? "Where are you from?" asked Leslie. "Well, actually, I was born not too far from here," said Mrs. Drazil. "Then why do you say you come from Brazil?" asked Benjamin. "No, I said I wasn't from Brazil," said Mrs. Drazil. "Have you ever been to Brazil?" asked Eric Fry. "No," exclaimed Mrs. Drazil. "It was just a little joke. Brazil rhymes with Drazil. I thought it might help you remember my name." Terence laughed. "Drazil, Brazil!" he shouted. "That's funny!" Several other kids laughed too, but not Dee. She had heard of Mrs. Drazil somewhere. She was sure of it, and whatever she had heard, she was sure it wasn't good. There was a TV show that Dee liked to watch. It was about real criminals. At the end of the show, they always asked the viewers to call the police if they knew where any of the criminals were. Dee wondered if she had seen Mrs. Drazil on that show. "Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask me?" asked Mrs. Drazil. Ron raised his hand. Mrs. Drazil pointed to him. "How old are you?" asked Ron. Dana gasped. "You're not supposed to ask someone that," she said. "Yeah, especially someone as old as Mrs. Drazil," said Mac. Mrs. Drazil smiled. "I don't mind," she said. "I'm 66 years old. You can ask me anything you want." "Anything?" asked Joy. "I'm a teacher," said Mrs. Drazil. "That's what I'm here for." Paul raised his hand. "How much do you weigh?" he asked. £124, said Mrs. Drazil. "How much money do you make?" asked Eric Bacon. "Well, I'm a supply teacher," explained Mrs. Drazil, "so I only make money on days that I teach, and then I make $51.18 a day." "What a rip-off!" said Jenny. "You should make at least 200. "That would be nice," said Mrs. Drazil. "But I'm a teacher because I love to teach. I love to see young children learn." Joy raised her hand. "How many men have you kissed in your whole life?" Mrs. Drazil thought a moment, as she appeared to be counting on her fingers. 31, she said. Everyone gasped. Dee raised her hand. Mrs. Drazil smiled at her. "Yes, the girl in the pretty flowered T-shirt." "Have you ever been to jail?" asked Dee. "No," said Mrs. Drazil. "Are the police after you?" "No," said Mrs. Drazil. Dee still didn't trust her. "OK," said Mrs. Drazil. "Now, before we get started, I want to say one more thing. I enjoy teaching so much that sometimes I get a little carried away. I talk too much. So if I start to get boring, will somebody please raise your hand and tell me?" "For real?" asked Todd. "You want us to tell you to stop talking?" "And we won't get in trouble?" asked Bibi. "No, of course not," said Mrs. Drazil. "You'll be helping me and the rest of the class. You're not going to learn anything if you're bored." "Cool," said Terence. "Oh, I suppose when I first started teaching, I used to be a little more strict," said Mrs. Drazil. "I even worried about things like whether my students had clean fingernails or if their shirts were tucked in." She laughed. "But times have changed. I've changed. Besides, the kids were a lot worse back then. At least, some of them were." For just a second, her sweet face turned sour as she looked at her notebook on her desk. Then she smiled again. I believe teaching requires mutual cooperation. I will cooperate with you, and you need to cooperate with me. If we work together, we'll have a very enjoyable learning experience. Her face turned sour again. But if you cross me, you will be very, very sorry. She ran her fingers over her blue notebook. Oh, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday I will get you. You can run, but you can't hide. She smiled. Okay, let's get started. Chapter 14. A light bulb, a pencil sharpener, a coffee pot, and a sack of potatoes. Galileo was a great scientist, said Mrs. Drizzle. He was born in Italy in 1564 and died in 1642. He was the first person to use a telescope to study the stars, and he also helped figure out the laws of gravity. Oh, I know about gravity, said Joe. Mrs. Jules pushed a computer out the window. It fell a lot faster than a pencil. Well, I don't think so, said Mrs. Drizzle. Galileo proved that all objects fall at the same speed. He conducted a very famous experiment. He dropped lots of different objects off the Leaning Tower of Pisa. The Leaning Tower of Pisa is in Italy. It was built in... Todd raised his hand. You're getting a little boring, he said. Oh, my goodness, am I? Asked Mrs. Drizzle. Rondi, Leslie, Paul and Calvin nodded their heads. I'm sorry, said Mrs. Drizzle. She thought a moment. I know, she exclaimed. Let's do the experiment here. The children cheered. They loved experiments. Mrs. Drizzle rubbed her hands together. Let's see. We'll need a coffee pot, a pencil sharpener, a light bulb, and... She thought a moment. We need something heavy. An elephant is heavy, said Benjamin. There are no elephants in Wayside School, said Mrs. Drizzle. Everyone laughed. Oh, how about a sack of potatoes? Asked Ron. I bet Miss Mush has one. Go and see, said Mrs. Drizzle. There's a coffee pot down in the office, said Stephen. Go get it, said Mrs. Drizzle. If I had a screwdriver, I could get that pencil sharpener off the wall, said Eric Fry. I've got a screwdriver, said Jenny. Can we use a fluorescent light bulb? Asked Bebe. She looked up at the ceiling. I guess so, said Mrs. Drizzle. How do I get it? Asked Bebe. You're the scientist, said Mrs. Drizzle. You figure it out. Bebe put her chair on top of her desk and stood on it. She still couldn't reach the ceiling. Hey, Benjamin, let me have your chair. She put Benjamin's chair on top of hers, but she still wasn't tall enough. Calvin dumped the wastepaper basket onto the floor. Try this, he said. Bebe turned the trash can upside down and put it on top of Benjamin's chair. Then she climbed on top, but she still couldn't quite reach. Leslie brought the class dictionary. Jenny and Dana donated their maths books. Cherie grabbed Mrs. Drizzle's old blue notebook. Put that down, yelled Mrs. Drizzle. Right now. Cherie dropped the notebook. Mrs. Drizzle's kindly old face had suddenly turned mean. Don't ever touch that again, Mrs. Drizzle ordered. Cherie returned trembling to her seat. Everyone was staring at Mrs. Drizzle. She smiled sweetly. Oh, go back to what you were doing, she said. Jason threw Bebe his lunchbox. She put it on top of the books, then climbed on top. Standing on her tiptoes, she was able to pull the cover off the fluorescent light. She grabbed the light just as the pile collapsed beneath her. She fell to the ground, triumphantly holding the unbroken light bulb high above her head. Ron returned with a sack of potatoes for Miss Mush. Stephen returned with Mr. Kidswatter's coffee pot. Eric Fry unscrewed the pencil sharpener from the wall. Mrs. Drizzle wrote coffee pot, sack of potatoes, pencil sharpener, and light bulb on the blackboard. Now, we're going to drop all 4 objects out of the window at the same time, she said. How many people think the coffee pot will hit the ground first? Is there coffee in it? Asked John. It's about half full, Stephen reported. 8 kids thought the coffee pot would hit the ground first. 16 thought the sack of potatoes would hit the ground first. 3 thought the light bulb would be first. Only Terence thought the pencil sharpener would hit first. Jason, Jenny, Joe, John and Joy were the judges. Mrs. Drizzle sent them outside. Stephen held the coffee pot out one window, Bebe held the light bulb out another, Eric Fry held the pencil sharpener out another, and Ron held out the sack of potatoes. Everyone else crowded around to watch. With everyone on the same side of the classroom, the school leaned a little bit, just like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. On your marks, get set, let go, said Mrs. Drizzle. The objects fell through the air and smashed against the pavement. A short while later, the judges returned. Their clothes were splattered with coffee. Jenny had bits of potato in her hair. Was the pencil sharpener first? Asked Terence. It happened so fast, said Joe. They all hit about the same time. But the coffee pot made the coolest explosion, said Jason. I think the light bulb hit the ground last, said John. Well, that's possible, said Mrs. Drizzle. Gravity causes all objects to fall at the same rate, but air slows them down. That's called air resistance, and that's good, otherwise raindrops would kill us. Air resistance slows all things down a little bit, but it has a greater effect on very light objects such as a piece of paper. And of course the shape of the paper is important too. A crumpled up piece of paper will fall faster than... You're getting boring again, said Mac. Mrs. Drizzle stopped talking. Now we need a new pencil sharpener, said Leslie. And Paul licked her ear. Well, I'll see you tomorrow for 2 more chapters.